December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m. The American morning explodes. At Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet is burning. The battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia are crippled at their moorings. In the first 2 hours, the Empire of Japan destroys nearly 200 American aircraft, most of them on the ground, wingtip to wingtip, before they could even turn a propeller. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, allegedly stares out at the ocean, somber. While his pilots celebrate, he fears they have done the unthinkable. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." In Berlin, the reaction is different.
Adolf Hitler is euphoric.
He declares war on the United States 4 days later, convinced that American society is a decaying house of cards, a mongrel nation of cowboys and jazz musicians, too soft and distracted by consumerism to fight a total war. His predictions seemed to be confirmed hour by hour. But what Hitler didn't know was that in Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt had already activated a plan that Axis strategists considered physically impossible, a plan that would bury the Third Reich under a tidal wave of steel and turn their tactical victories into the most catastrophic strategic defeat in military history. The problem was simple, yet devastating for the Americans. Music, slow, melancholic cello shifting to industrial rhythm. The United States was an economic superpower, but a military dwarf. Its army ranked 18th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. Its industry was entirely civilian, focused on building refrigerators, radios, and automobiles. The mighty factories of Detroit, Flint, and Pontiac were geared for profit, not war. And they were totally unprepared. With the Axis powers controlling nearly all of Europe and the Japanese sweeping across the Pacific, time was running out. Without a conversion of industry, there would be no tanks. Without tanks, there would be no liberation. Without an army, democracy itself would perish. German and Japanese generals had calculated this with mathematical precision. They believed that by the time America could retool its factories, the war would already be over. If you want to discover how the U.S. turned this apparent death sentence into the greatest logistical miracle in history, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories that changed the course of the war. Music, rising, determined orchestral score. The plan that FDR and his production czar, William S. Knudsen, the former president of General Motors, activated in early 1942, had no precedent in human history. It was called the Victory Program, and its objective was literally impossible by any known manufacturing standard. The goal wasn't just to build weapons. It was to stop the production of civilian goods entirely and turn the entire American economy into one single machine of war. We aren't just talking about building a few extra factories. We are talking about ripping out the assembly lines of the world's greatest automotive companies and replacing them with machinery to build tanks and bombers, almost overnight. President Roosevelt issued a direct ultimatum, known as the impossible numbers. He demanded the production of 50,000 aircraft a year. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a staggeringly high figure that his own advisors said couldn't be done. Knudsen didn't threaten to shoot executives, but the message was clear. The survival of the free world rests on your assembly lines. Do it or we all speak German. Axis intelligence intercepted the public announcements of these production goals. Hermann Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe, dismissed it as desperate propaganda. He reportedly laughed, saying, "Americans only know how to make razor blades and refrigerators. It is physically impossible to produce heavy industry on that scale in wartime." They weren't lying. The transformation began immediately. In Detroit, workers tore down machinery music while the news of defeats in the Pacific poured in. Every lathe, every press, every tool and die was repurposed. At Willow Run, outside Detroit, Henry Ford's engineers faced a daunting task. They had to turn a cornfield into the largest room in the history of the world, a factory aimed at producing the B-24 Liberator bomber. Critics called it Willen. They said you couldn't build an airplane like a car. But the workers worked music in 24-hour shifts. Rosie the Riveter took her place on the line. They slept in trailers, ate quickly, and went back to the rivets. The sheer scale was mind-numbing. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, documented the process. We had to design a line where raw aluminum went in one end and a flying machine came out the other. Normally, this would take years to perfect. We had to do it in months. Men and women worked until they dropped, were replaced, and the line kept moving. By the time the line fully roared to life, it was a beast of efficiency. The Germans looked at the map and saw territory. They didn't see the supply chain. But building the factories was only half the problem. The other half was making them produce at a speed that defied logic. The trains and trucks poured into Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh music. These weren't just factories anymore. They were the arsenal of democracy. There was no heating up period. The American solution was brutally simple: overwhelm the enemy with volume. While one team was pouring concrete for a new wing of the factory, another team was already installing the heavy presses on the wet floor. While electricians wired the lights, the first M4 Sherman tanks were already rolling off the line music under temporary roofs. At the Detroit Arsenal, the first production lines activated in record time. The first M4 Sherman didn't just trickle out. They began to flow like a river of steel. They were sent directly to North Africa and Europe, where the German panzers reigned supreme. And type Arsenal in the comments if you're discovering this incredible story. The numbers of the conversion defy comprehension. The U.S. auto industry alone produced more military equipment than the entire industrial base of Germany combined. 297,000 aircraft were built during the war. 86,000 tanks rolled out of American factories. 2,710 Liberty ships were launched, ships built so fast that by 1944, one was being completed every single day. And all this happened while the Allies were initially losing battle after battle. A Japanese general might have written in 1942, "Our intelligence reports that American shipyards are replacing carriers faster than we can sink them. It is impossible. We crippled their fleet at Pearl Harbor." It wasn't impossible. It was the reality the Axis refused to accept. What the Germans and Japanese hadn't anticipated was that the Americans hadn't just converted their factories, they had revolutionized mass production. The scattered workshops of Europe could not compete with the integrated assembly lines of Michigan. Willow Run was not just a factory. It was an industrial monster. It turned the complex art of bomber construction into a repetitive, high-speed science. Efficiency increased dramatically. In the beginning, building a bomber took weeks. At Willow Run, after the reorganization, a B-24 Liberator rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. The Americans hadn't just saved their military. They had transformed it into a war machine more efficient than anything Germany could match. The Panzers paid the price. The German Tiger and Panther tanks were engineering marvels. Technically, they were superior. Their 88mm guns could destroy a Sherman from a mile away. The Sherman's armor was thinner, its gun was smaller. German crews mocked the Sherman, calling them Ronsons because they lit up the first time you hit them. But for every Tiger tank the Germans managed to handcraft, the Detroit Arsenal sent 5 M4 Shermans to the battlefield. General George Patton understood the math. We don't need a better tank. We need more tanks. It was a massacre of attrition. The numbers are devastating. In the Battle of the Bulge, or in the hedgerows of Normandy, German aces would destroy 3 or 4 Shermans, only to look over the hill and see 10 more coming. German tank production peaked in 1944 at about 19,000 vehicles. The United States produced nearly 30,000 tanks that same year, while simultaneously building the world's largest Navy and Air Force. The factories that Hitler thought were too decadent to fight were producing weapons at a rhythm Germany could never equal. If you are still watching this, you are witnessing the engine of history. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more revelations like this. The Tiger tank became an endangered species not because it was a bad tank, but because it was drowned in a sea of olive drab steel. It didn't matter how technically superior they were. When Germany lost a Tiger, it took months of skilled labor to replace it. When the Allies lost a Sherman, Another one was already being unloaded at the docks of Antwerp. The total tonnage of bombs dropped, and steel fielded by the Allies crushed the Wehrmacht. Most of this material came from factories that didn't even exist in 1940. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, wrote after the war, "Our biggest strategic mistake was underestimating the industrial capacity of the United States. We thought that their consumer culture made them weak. Instead, it gave them the infrastructure to mass-produce war." It wasn't just a miscalculation, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were facing. The Germans thought in terms of tactical victories, winning the duel. The Americans thought in terms of logistics and supply chains. As long as Detroit kept humming, the war was won. The transformation of 1942 was not an act of desperation. It was the most important strategic pivot of World War II. The conditions were grueling. The workers at Willow Run and the shipyards faced housing shortages, rationing, and exhaustion. Music, but they didn't stop. Thousands of accidents occurred, lives were lost on the home front, so that millions of soldiers could have the tools to fight. It is an uncomfortable reality. The industrial machines saved the world, but the human effort was colossal. But without that arsenal of democracy, without those sacrifices, the swastika might still fly over Paris, and the history of the 20th century would have been very different. The last German Tiger tanks were destroyed in the ruins of Berlin in 1945. They were overwhelmed, not just by Russian T-34s from the east, but by American Shermans and Mustangs from the west, machines born in the converted auto plants of Detroit. From the first Jeep that rolled off the line in 1941 to the final victory, the American industrial base music produced over 300,000 aircraft and produced the equipment for the entire Allied alliance. Each of those machines represented a defeat for the Axis plan of 1941. Each was proof that the decadent American method was not only possible, it was the recipe to destroy tyranny and win the deadliest war in human history. What do you think of this unprecedented logistical operation? Did you know the real scale of the American industrial mobilization? Leave us a comment and subscribe to our channel. Every week we bring you verified and fascinating stories